Hi everyone, and welcome back from fall break. This week in class, we're going to continue our exploration of sexology by focusing on how this new scientific field became a global enterprise during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. To give us a sense of sexology's global dimensions, I'd like to begin this lecture with an anecdote, one that revolves around one particular European sexologist and his journey all around the world. That sexologist was Magnus Hirschfeld, and my anecdote begins in November 1930, when Hirschfeld left his work at the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin to embark on a worldwide lecture tour. The tour, which lasted about 500 days, saw Hirschfeld deliver talks in dozens of countries, including India, where for 8.5 weeks he traveled by train from Madras to Calcutta to Delhi to Bombay, speaking to medical associations and women's clubs on topics like sex pathology, homosexuality, inborn or acquired, and love, sex, and marriage. As evidence of how popular these talks were, see this letter that a reader in the Bombay Chronicle sent in to the paper's editor in 1931. A lecture that Hirschfeld gave at Grant Medical College in Bombay is typical of the talks he gave in India in many respects. An Indian newspaper reporter summarized this as follows. Dr. Hirschfeld began by explaining the various aspects of sexology. It was not only a medical science, he added, but a very important social science as well. A time had come when they had to give this science its due place in human knowledge. Ignorance and the world traditions in this respect had brought about disasters under which the present-day humanity was suffering. The doctor then explained various forms of homosexuality and how they were practiced. The slides that were exhibited on the magic lantern were deeply instructive. They were the rarest cases of abnormalities of the sexual impulse. As these words indicate, among India's educated middle classes, there was at this time great interest in issues of sexual reproduction and reform. Moreover, as this favorable review of Hirschfeld's tour demonstrates, many Indians believed that science was the key to national progress, modernization, and possibly even independence from the British Empire, which had ruled over India and would until 1947. Indeed, when Hirschfeld came to India in 1931, he found that Indian scientists were already discussing many of the topics that he was researching. One of the individuals he met with here was Girindra Bose, founder of the Indian Psychoanalytic Society, which had been established 10 years earlier in 1921. Bose was one of a number of Indian scientists interested in sexology. Others included N.S. Phadke and A.P. Pillai, both of whom were active in India's nationalist eugenics movement. In his writings, Phadke tried to connect ancient Indian thought and scientific sexology. His approach to eugenics was, at the time, quite socially progressive. He questioned the taboo of caste marriage. By contrast, Pillai was a sex reformer, and his views drew upon the writings of Havelock Ellis. In 1927, he published a book called The Sex Problem in India, which also aimed to connect modern scientific knowledge with ancient Indian wisdom. As Pillai saw it, sexual pleasure was a universal right, something that men and women were equally entitled to. Pillai's vision of gender equality had limits, but he was a proponent of the education of women and of sex education in particular. Another key figure in early 20th century Indian sexology was Swami Shivananda. Around the same time that Hirschfeld was giving lectures all across India, Shivananda published a series of books providing all manner of sexual advice. More than anything else, Shivananda's books offered guidance on how married couples could conceive healthy children. Shivananda's books were littered with references to the works of European sexologists like Havelock Ellis and Richard von Krafft-Ebing. At the same time, he cited lots of ancient Indian medical texts, and in particular, the Kama Sutra. His principal argument was that if Indian couples wanted to make their nation strong, they would need to practice what he called brahmacharya, or sexual self-restraint. Interestingly, it does not appear that Hirschfeld spent much time talking to any of the aforementioned individuals. Had he done so, it's likely that he would have disagreed with many of their ideas. In Hirschfeld's 1933 book, Men and Women, The World Journey of a Sexologist, he credited the Kama Sutra for being the first sexological text in world history. But according to Hirschfeld, this ancient progress was halted by a lengthy period of stagnation and regression, during which time India succumbed to punitive, prohibitive moral and religious understandings of sexuality. Thus, according to Hirschfeld, the contemporary state of Indian sexology was far less advanced than that seen in Europe. In reality, however, there were some fundamental similarities between Hirschfeld and his Indian counterparts. Both claimed that their ideas were grounded in scientific principles. Both believed that sexual science was critical to modernization, and both used mass media to disseminate their ideas. Also, both arrived at their ideas through a consideration of various forms of knowledge and writing, some Western and some not. All of this points to something incredibly important about sexology. This was a global formation, something that took shape through exchanges of knowledge and conversations happening across many different countries. As historians are increasingly coming to recognize, sexual science was a transnational phenomenon. Its advocates existed not only in Europe and North America, but also in places like Shanghai, Mexico City, Tokyo, Bombay, Tel Aviv, Moscow, Santiago, and Buenos Aires. Its key figures were not only Europeans like Hirschfeld, Ellis, Carpenter, and Krafft-Ebing, but also Indians like Swami Shivananda. The historical scholarship on sexology now includes not just texts focusing on the West, but also books like Sabine Frühstück's Colonizing Sex, Sexology and Social Control in Modern Japan, Liat Kozma's Policing Egyptian Women, Sex, Law, and Medicine in Egypt, Johanna Misilinska and Robert Kolpa's Decentering Western Sexualities, Central and Eastern European Perspectives, and Howard Chiang's After Eunuchs, Science, Medicine, and the Transformation of Sex in Modern China. As all of these works make clear, sexual science was a traveling culture, something born of the movements of people, practices, and ideas all across the world. These movements frequently produced collisions and contestations, as sexology was given a variety of different meanings and used for a variety of different purposes in different countries. Thus, although forged through a global network, sexology was fragmented and fractured. As historians are coming to recognize, sexual science did not become global through the West imposing its ideas on the rest of the world. Instead, it became global because, in their interpretations of Western sexological texts, actors in Asia, Africa, and Latin America generated new meaning out of these texts, and selectively appropriated concepts from them to suit their own interests. Thus, the story of global sexual science is not the story of non-Western peoples being influenced by Western ideas. As an example of this, consider the fact that Richard von Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis was published not just in German, but also in French, in Italian, in Spanish, in English, and also in Dutch, Russian, Hungarian, and Japanese. Krafft-Ebing's writings were translated into a variety of different languages, which enabled people all across the world to engage with his ideas. On account of Western colonialism, those who read and wrote in these languages often lived outside Europe, and in debating Krafft-Ebing's ideas, debates about erotic desire and sexual practices became global. This helps us understand why sexuality plays such a prominent role in debates about politics, science, and religion all across the world. However, we ought not assume that after reading the Psychopathia Sexualis, readers in Japan, Latin America, Africa, and Asia simply started thinking like Krafft-Ebing. Far from it. They accepted some of what he said, they rejected other parts of the text, and in other cases, they added their own ideas, thus creating a variety of different sexological traditions all across the world. From the very beginning, the sexual body that Krafft-Ebing and other Western sexologists created was a contested figure. As one historian has put it, putting sexology in a transnational context gives us less a single picture than a rough-edged mosaic of sexual modernity across the globe. This is one of the key points that has emerged out of the new scholarship on sexology's global dimensions. In looking at how modern sex research developed in places like China, Japan, Egypt, Palestine, Peru, and Russia, we've come to realize that the term sexuality is not a Western construct transmitted around the world. Instead, there was dialogue and negotiation. Thus, in order to fully understand the relationship between sexuality and modernity, we need to decenter the West. For one, many of the key ideas in Western sexology actually came from outside the West. Secondly, as European sexological knowledge moved outside of Europe, it was often transformed into something quite different. Sexologists in Asia, Africa, and Latin America exercised considerable selectivity in choosing aspects of this science most relevant to their particular agendas. Often, these appropriations were subversive. And sometimes they were used to do things that European sexologists would have disagreed with. New kinds of sexology were created through the fusing of pre-existing cultural and scientific traditions with those coming out of Europe. There was, thus, hybridization. When we examine how sexological ideas were received by men and women in places like Russia, Egypt, Japan, and Brazil, we learn that in the process of translating these into new political, disciplinary, and cultural contexts, sexology became increasingly heterogeneous as a field. Instead of being universal, it was variegated. It became, for example, not just the business of men, but also, in many cases, of feminist activists. Thus, when we examine sexology in a global context, we can see that this is about much more than a project of tracing how certain ideas spread from a center to the margins. It is a way of asking new questions about the role of sexuality in shaping how the human came to be apprehended and politicized around the turn of the century. Speaking of that, I have some questions for you. Once you've had a chance to think about these, please do head over to our discussion board and post your thoughts. I look forward to looking at your comments and commenting on them, and I will see you all later.